Alright, we're going to start Chapter 5, Early Society in East Asia. Early society in East Asia is complex, and this is due in large part to the fact that it's sometimes difficult to ascertain exactly what was real and what was made up. It wasn't until just recently that historians were able to find actual archaeological evidence suggesting the existence of early Chinese dynasties such as the Jia and the Shang. Why didn't people just write down the history of these civilizations? Well, they did, just not until later during the Zhou dynasty, but what they wrote down was probably largely fictional and/or flat-out lies. However, recent archaeological evidence suggests these early societies did actually exist. So we're going to begin our study with Chinese history with the Jia dynasty. But first we need to understand what is meant by the term dynasty. A dynasty is a ruling family. In China they are ruled by emperors, and these emperors passed down their power to their sons when they passed away. Although there are a few exceptions to male dominance, and we're going to talk about those situations in due time. The Jia dynasty was thought to have been in power sometime around 2200 BCE until about 1766 BCE, and it is probable that the Jia dynasty ruled through tributary power. In other words, rather than direct control of the villages on the Huanghe River, aka the River of Sorrows, or the Yao River, I wish they would just pick a name and stick with it, it is likely that these villages maintained autonomy. Autonomy means self-rule, and they maintained this autonomy in exchange for payment in the form of crops. It is also likely that the notion of controlling the flow of the Huanghe was central to the Jia's ability to maintain power. Through dikes, dams, and irrigation systems, they ensured food supply was always readily available. For reasons we're going to discuss shortly, the Jia dynasty will lose power and ultimately be replaced by the Shang dynasty. The Shang dynasty rose to power, in large part due to monopoly. And no, not the monopoly you play at home, or even that wonderful monopoly that McDonald's puts out every year. And by the way, what is up with McDonald's doing monopoly? I mean, haven't they ruined our society enough? Now they have to get their greedy fat fingers on my beloved board games? It's just annoying. But the monopoly we're talking about in this case is in regards to the Shang dynasty and their monopoly on copper and tin. Controlling copper and tin meant that you controlled the production of bronze, which was the most advanced metallurgy in China at that time. They used this bronze to outfit their army and for agricultural purposes. There was a permanent force of about 1,000 soldiers in the Shang capital at all times, and they had at least 5 different capitals throughout the reign, which meant that military was vitally important. But we know they could muster up to forces as high as 13,000, conscripting soldiers from all walks of life, although primarily soldiers were noblemen and their sons. Another important aspect of the Shang was the development of ancestor worship. They believed that one should honor their ancestors, both personal and past emperors, with the hopes that they would directly intervene on their behalf with the principal god Shangdi. In other words, if you had something you wanted done, or you wanted to have a good harvest, you need to directly appeal to those who came before you. As is the case with all Chinese dynasties, rebellions likely tied to agricultural output weakened the Shang to the point where they were overtaken by a rival clan known as the Zhou. The Zhou dynasty is responsible for much of our early historical understanding of the Jia and the Shang because they recorded the classic of history. The classic of history is pretty much a self-promoting publication. What I mean by that is that it puts down past dynasties and promotes their own wonderfulness. However, it is critical in helping us to understand the concept of a mandate of heaven. The Zhou explicitly explained that the Jia collapsed due to the emperor being involved in large orgies. Yes, I actually just said orgies. If you need to understand this further, do not search it in Google. Rather, find Miss Breeze and ask her. They also explained that part of the reason why the Shang lost the mandate of heaven was because they kept eating the remains of their defeated enemies. While both these are likely lies, it does reinforce the belief that the heavens wanted them, the Zhou, to rule, and offered them some legitimacy. There are 2 other important concepts to understand in relation to the Zhou: feudalism and Confucianism. The Zhou dynasty ruled a feudal state more or less. Power and land ownership was passed down generationally, as were titles. Unlike the feudalism we think of in the Middle Ages, they didn't rule from castles. Noblemen of the Chinese dynasties ruled from walled cities, and this system worked well for over 800 years. But as you can imagine, these noble families will grow in wealth and power, and over the generations, ultimately become powerful enough to resist the Zhou. However, perhaps the most important aspect of the Zhou dynasty was the introduction of Confucianism. We will talk a great deal more about Confucianism in future chapters, so I will be brief about it here. Confucius was a scholar who proposed that proper moral behavior and adherence to your status in society was a recipe for success. In other words, you do what you're supposed to do. This is why the Zhou Book of Rites was so important. It literally outlined proper moral behavior in all social situations. Therefore, if one was educated in the Book of Rites, they'd be more effective members of society. Life works well, as I said before, under this Confucian philosophy for a number of years. There are also two other important philosophies that emerged during this time period, legalism and Taoism. But we'll focus on these in later chapters as well. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. The coming of the Iron Age meant that the wealthy nobles could outfit their armies with iron weapons and eventually declare their independence from the Zhou, throwing China into a period of warring states. The warring states period is basically a 200-year period where several different states are in charge of China instead of just one unified empire. This system will remain in place till 221 BCE, when the Qin dynasty, which gives China its name, will ultimately take power, reinforcing the ideas of Confucianism.